On the morning of September 27th, 1963, at approximately 11 a.m., a man later described as being in his early 20s, approximately 5 feet 9 inches tall, with light brown hair and wearing dark slacks and a light-colored shirt, entered the Soviet embassy compound on Calzada de Tacubaya in the Mixcoac neighborhood of Mexico City. The embassy occupied a three-story building surrounded by walls and gates, typical of Cold War diplomatic installations designed as much for security as for representation. The man approached the entrance, spoke briefly with a guard, and was admitted inside. He remained in the building for approximately 1 hour and 12 minutes before emerging and walking back toward the street, where he turned left and disappeared into the flow of pedestrian traffic. The man's visit would have been unremarkable, except for two facts. First, the Soviet embassy in Mexico City was under continuous photographic surveillance by the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, as part of an operation codenamed LILYRIC, which had been running since 1960. Second, the man who entered the embassy that morning would, within 6 weeks, be accused of assassinating the President of the United States. His name was Lee Harvey Oswald, but on September 27, 1963, the CIA officers monitoring the embassy did not know that. They would not definitively identify him from their surveillance photographs until after November 22, 1963, the day President John F. Kennedy was shot in Dallas, Texas, and when analysts finally connected the surveillance images to Oswald's identity in the urgent review that followed the assassination. The identification process would involve meticulous attention to physical details captured on film, details so subtle they had been overlooked in the initial analysis. Before we follow Lee Harvey Oswald into that Soviet embassy compound and uncover how exhaustive photographic analysis would later connect him to one of history's most consequential crimes, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We bring you documented Cold War intelligence operations every week, separating myth from historical record. Now, let's return to Mexico City, September 1963. Mexico City in 1963 was a focal point of Cold War intelligence operations. The Mexican capital hosted embassies and diplomatic missions from both sides of the ideological divide, making it a valuable location for recruitment, intelligence collection, and clandestine meetings between operatives who could not safely meet in more heavily monitored cities like Washington or Moscow. The Soviet embassy served as headquarters not only for legitimate diplomatic personnel, but also for intelligence officers from the KGB, operating under diplomatic cover. Similarly, the Cuban embassy, located several miles away in the Cuauhtémoc neighborhood, functioned as a hub for Cuban intelligence services and revolutionary activities. The CIA's Mexico City station, operating under the cover of the U.S. Embassy, maintained surveillance operations on both the Soviet and Cuban embassies. The station chief was Winston McKinley Scott, known to colleagues as Win Scott, a career CIA officer who had been posted to Mexico City in 1956. Scott, 53 years old in 1963, had spent decades in intelligence work, including service during World War II with the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, the CIA's predecessor organization. He was known for his meticulous approach to counterintelligence and for his ability to cultivate productive relationships with Mexican intelligence and security services. The LILYRIC operation involved multiple components: photographic surveillance cameras, concealed in buildings with sight lines to the embassy entrances, automatically photographed everyone entering and exiting the Soviet and Cuban compounds, audio surveillance equipment installed through cooperation with the Mexican authorities, captured telephone conversations to and from the embassies. The CIA also maintained human surveillance, agents who physically followed persons of interest after they left the embassy grounds. All of this information was processed, cataloged, and analyzed by intelligence officers working out of the CIA station in the U.S. Embassy compound on Paseo de la Reforma. The volume of material generated was enormous, dozens or even hundreds of photographs per day, hours of audio recordings, written reports from field agents. The photographs were developed, cataloged, and stored, but detailed analysis was reserved for individuals who could be identified as intelligence officers, known agents, or persons of particular interest. Lee Harvey Oswald had been on the CIA's radar in a peripheral way since 1959, when he had defected to the Soviet Union. Oswald, then 20 years old and a former U.S. Marine Corps radar operator, had traveled to Moscow, renounced his American citizenship at the U.S. Embassy, and declared his intention to provide the Soviets with information he possessed about American military operations. During his service in the Marine Corps, Oswald had been involved in an incident in October 1957 in which he had accidentally shot himself in the left elbow with a .22 caliber pistol while on duty in the Philippines. The injury had required medical treatment and had resulted in permanent nerve damage and limited mobility in his left arm. According to medical evaluations documented in his service records, the injury had healed but had left Oswald with reduced strength and flexibility in the arm, which affected his posture and caused a barely perceptible asymmetry in his gait. His left shoulder sat slightly lower than his right, and he walked with a subtle irregularity that was noticeable to careful observers. The CIA had opened a file on Oswald as a defector and had monitored reports about his life in the Soviet Union, where he married a Russian woman named Marina Prusakova, worked at a radio factory in Minsk, and became disillusioned with Soviet life. In June 1962, Oswald, Marina, and their infant daughter June returned to the United States. Oswald settled initially in Fort Worth, Texas, where he worked briefly at a metalworking factory. His life in Texas was unstable. He moved frequently, struggled to maintain employment, and exhibited behavior that those who knew him described as erratic, ideologically confused, and increasingly volatile. He professed Marxist beliefs, subscribed to communist publications, attempted to form a local chapter of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, an organization that advocated for improved U.S.-Cuba relations, and became obsessed with political figures and causes. In April 1963, evidence would later suggest, Oswald attempted to assassinate retired U.S. Army General Edwin Walker, a right-wing political figure, by firing a rifle through a window of Walker's Dallas home. The bullet missed, and Oswald was not initially connected to the shooting. By September 1963, Oswald's marriage was deteriorating. Marina had moved out of their apartment and was living with a friend. Oswald, 23 years old, unemployed, and increasingly isolated, made a decision to travel to Mexico City. His stated purpose, according to later testimony and documentation, was to obtain visas that would allow him to travel to Cuba and, from there, to defect once again to the Soviet Union. He believed that returning to the Soviet Union would allow him to escape what he perceived as a hostile and oppressive American society. Oswald traveled by bus from Texas to Mexico City, arriving on the morning of September 27, 1963. The city was warm and humid, typical for late September, and morning traffic already filled the streets as he made his way from the bus terminal. He checked into the Hotel del Comercio, a modest establishment in the historic center of the city, registering under his own name. That same day, he began his attempts to secure the travel documents he needed. Oswald's first stop was the Cuban embassy, located on Calle Francisco Marquez in a residential neighborhood several miles from the city center. He arrived in late morning and met with consular officials, explaining his desire to travel to Cuba. He presented documentation showing his past residence in the Soviet Union and his political activities in the United States, including his Fair Play for Cuba Committee membership. The consular officials, according to later accounts, were skeptical. Obtaining a Cuban visa required approval from Havana, a process that could take weeks or months. Oswald wanted to travel immediately. The officials told him he would need Soviet approval first, as his ultimate destination was the Soviet Union, and that without it, the Cuban government would not issue him a visa. Oswald became visibly frustrated, his voice rising as he argued with the officials, insisting that his political loyalty and past residence in the Soviet Union should expedite the process. The meeting ended without resolution. From the Cuban embassy, Oswald walked and took public transportation several miles across the city to the Soviet embassy on Calzada de Tacubaya. The heat had intensified by the time he arrived around 11 a.m., and his shirt clung to his back as he approached the compound. Traffic noise from the busy avenue echoed off the embassy walls. The Soviet guard at the entrance, a man in his 50s with a weathered face, regarded Oswald with the practiced neutrality of someone accustomed to evaluating visitors for threat level. After a brief exchange, Oswald was admitted inside. According to later testimony from Soviet officials, including KGB officers who were present and who were interviewed after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Oswald met with consular personnel in a small office on the building's second floor. He explained his situation. He had lived in the Soviet Union from 1959 to 1962. He had returned to the United States against his better judgment. His life in America had become intolerable, and he wanted to return to the Soviet Union as soon as possible. He requested that the Soviet government issue him a visa immediately, emphasizing his previous residence and his commitment to Marxist ideology. The Soviet officials, like their Cuban counterparts, were not prepared to accommodate Oswald's demands. Visa processing required time, background checks, and approval from Moscow. This was standard procedure for all applicants, and no exceptions would be made. Oswald became increasingly agitated as the officials explained the bureaucratic requirements. According to the accounts of those present, he raised his voice, insisted that he was a loyal supporter of the Soviet Union, referenced his military service and the classified information he claimed to have provided to Soviet intelligence during his defection, and demanded that exceptions be made for him based on his past cooperation. The Soviet officials remained firm, their expressions unchanging. They told Oswald that his application would be processed through normal channels and that he should expect a response in several months. One official later recalled that Oswald seemed desperate, almost pleading, as if his entire future depended on immediate approval. Oswald left the Soviet embassy after approximately 1 hour and 12 minutes, emerging onto Calzada de Tacubaya around 12:15 p.m. Outside, CIA surveillance cameras positioned in a building across the street captured multiple photographs of him as he exited the compound and walked away, his shoulders slightly hunched, his gait reflecting both his physical asymmetry and his evident dejection. These photographs, however, were not immediately processed or reviewed in detail. They were developed as part of the routine batch processing of surveillance imagery, cataloged with a date and timestamp, and filed. Over the following days, Oswald made several more attempts to secure the visas he needed. On September the 28th, he returned to the Soviet embassy, again pressing his case with consular officials and again being told that the process could not be expedited. He also made multiple telephone calls to the Soviet embassy from public telephones in Mexico City. These conversations were captured by the CIA's audio surveillance system, which recorded all calls to and from the embassy. In the calls, Oswald identified himself by name and attempted to speak with specific officials, repeating his arguments for expedited visa processing. The calls were recorded and the audio reels were cataloged, but immediate transcription and analysis of every recorded conversation was impossible, given the volume of material generated daily. Oswald also returned to the Cuban embassy multiple times during his stay in Mexico City, each visit ending in frustration as officials reiterated that Cuban approval depended on Soviet approval and that neither could be obtained quickly. By October 31st, 1963, Oswald's efforts had completely failed. Neither the Cuban nor the Soviet government would provide him with the travel documents he sought. He left Mexico City by bus on October 2nd, returning to Texas. He arrived back in Dallas on October 3rd and resumed his unstable existence. The CIA's Mexico City station had generated documentation of Oswald's visits, including photographs and audio recordings, but the material was not immediately analyzed in detail. The photographs showed a young man entering and exiting the Soviet embassy on multiple dates, but the images were not of exceptionally high quality. Surveillance photography in 1963 relied on relatively primitive cameras and film compared to later technology, and the angles and lighting conditions were not always optimal. Analysts reviewing the photographs in the routine workflow described the subject as a white male in his 20s with dark hair, but beyond these general descriptors, no immediate identification was made. Then, on October 9th, 1963, more than a week after Oswald had left Mexico City, a CIA cable was sent from the Mexico City station to headquarters in Langley, Virginia. The cable reported that an individual identifying himself as Lee Harvey Oswald had contacted the Soviet embassy by telephone on September 28th. The cable noted that Oswald was a former U.S. Marine who had defected to the Soviet Union and later returned to the United States. The cable requested that headquarters provide any additional information available on Oswald. However, the cable also included a significant error. It described the individual who had visited the embassy as being approximately 35 years old, 6 feet tall, with an athletic build. This description did not match Lee Harvey Oswald, who was 23 years old, 5 feet 9 inches tall, and of slender build. The source of this erroneous description appears to have been photographs taken on a different date, possibly October 1st or 2nd, showing a different man visiting the Soviet embassy. Somehow, through a filing error or miscommunication within the station, these photographs had been mistakenly associated with the Oswald telephone intercepts. The result was that CIA headquarters believed Lee Harvey Oswald had visited the Soviet embassy in Mexico City, but that the available photographs did not show him, and that the man in the photographs was an unidentified subject whose connection to Oswald, if any, was unclear. This confusion persisted for the next 6 weeks. The surveillance photographs from late September, which actually did show Oswald, remained in the station's files, not flagged for priority analysis. The misidentified photographs from early October were filed separately. No one at the Mexico City station or at headquarters connected the dots or recognized the administrative error. The volume of intelligence material flowing through the station was simply too great, and Oswald was not considered a high-priority surveillance target. His file indicated he was a former defector who had returned to the United States, but there was no specific intelligence suggesting he posed an imminent threat to national security or that his activities warranted intensive monitoring. 6 weeks separated Oswald's frustrated departure from Mexico City and the moment that would make his name infamous. Those weeks passed without incident for the CIA analysts who had photographed but not identified him. Oswald, meanwhile, rented a room in Dallas under the alias O.H. Lee at a boarding house on North Beckley Avenue. Marina remained separated from him, living in Irving, Texas, with a friend. On October 15th, Oswald obtained employment at the Texas School Book Depository, a warehouse building located on Dealey Plaza in downtown Dallas. The building's windows overlooked the plaza and the streets below. By mid-November, the surveillance images from late September had been filed away in Mexico City, one set among thousands. No one was looking for Lee Harvey Oswald. No one knew there was any reason to watch him. On November 22nd, 1963, President John F. Kennedy visited Dallas as part of a political trip through Texas. Kennedy's motorcade route took him through Dealey Plaza, passing directly in front of the Texas School Book Depository. At approximately 12:30 p.m., as the presidential limousine turned onto Elm Street and moved slowly past cheering crowds, shots rang out. Kennedy was struck by bullets and mortally wounded. He was rushed to Parkland Memorial Hospital, where doctors worked frantically to save his life, but the injuries were catastrophic. President Kennedy was pronounced dead at 1 p.m. Within hours, Dallas police arrested Lee Harvey Oswald in connection with the assassination. He had been stopped in a movie theater in Oak Cliff after being identified as a suspect in the shooting of Dallas police officer J.D. Tippit, who had been killed approximately 45 minutes after the Kennedy assassination. Under interrogation over the next 2 days, Oswald denied involvement in either shooting. He claimed he was being framed, described himself as a patsy, and demanded legal representation. On November 24th, while being transferred from the city jail to the county jail, Oswald was shot and killed by Jack Ruby, a Dallas nightclub owner, in the basement of the Dallas police headquarters. Ruby fired a single shot into Oswald's abdomen as cameras recorded the moment for live television broadcast. Oswald died at Parkland Memorial Hospital, the same facility where President Kennedy had died 2 days earlier. Oswald's death meant that he never stood trial, and that many questions about his motivations and actions would remain forever unanswered. The assassination of President Kennedy triggered an immediate and intensive investigation by federal, state, and local authorities. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, assumed primary responsibility for investigating the crime, and President Lyndon B. Johnson, who had succeeded Kennedy, established a special commission headed by Chief Justice Earl Warren to conduct a comprehensive review of the assassination and related matters. The Warren Commission, as it became known, would spend 10 months interviewing witnesses, examining evidence, and producing a report intended to provide definitive answers about what had happened and why. In the immediate aftermath of the assassination, as Oswald's background became known and investigators learned of his defection to the Soviet Union and his recent trip to Mexico City, the CIA began an urgent review of its files. The revelation that Oswald had visited the Soviet and Cuban embassies in Mexico City just weeks before the assassination raised critical questions about whether foreign governments had been involved in the plot and whether the CIA's surveillance operations had missed intelligence that might have prevented the tragedy. Win Scott, the CIA station chief in Mexico City, received orders from headquarters to conduct an exhaustive review of all surveillance materials related to Oswald's visits. This included re-examining every photograph taken during the relevant time period, reviewing all audio recordings of telephone calls that might involve Oswald, and reconstructing a complete timeline of his movements while in Mexico City. The work was conducted under intense time pressure, with senior officials in Washington demanding immediate answers and with the knowledge that the CIA's credibility and competence were on the line. The photographic review presented immediate problems. The surveillance photographs that had been associated with Oswald's visits in early October clearly did not show him. The man in those images was too old, too tall, and bore no resemblance to Oswald's known appearance. This discrepancy raised urgent questions. Had the photographs of Oswald's actual visits been lost, misfiled, never successfully captured due to equipment failure or operator error? Station personnel began a painstaking process of reviewing all photographs taken during late September and early October, searching for images that might show the right man. The analyst who would make the critical identification worked in a small office on the third floor of the CIA's Mexico City station. Her name was Ann Goodpasture, and she had been with the station since 1957. Goodpasture, in her late 30s, in 1963, had a background in photographic analysis and had developed a reputation within the station for meticulous attention to detail and exceptional visual memory. She had been involved in the LILYRIC operation from its inception and had reviewed thousands of surveillance photographs over the years, often identifying individuals by comparing images taken months or years apart, noting subtle consistencies in appearance, clothing, or physical characteristics. Goodpasture began a review on November 23, 1963, the day after the assassination. Working 12 and 14-hour days, she systematically examined photographic files for late September, going through every image taken of individuals entering or exiting the Soviet embassy during the period when Oswald was known to have been in Mexico City. The work was tedious and mentally exhausting. Many photographs showed people from angles that made identification difficult. Backs of heads, profiles obscured by shadows, figures at distances that reduced clarity. She worked from known descriptors of Oswald: white male, early 20s, 5 feet 9 inches tall, slender build, light brown hair. She also had post-assassination photographs of Oswald taken by Dallas police and published in newspapers, which provided detailed references for facial features, build, and physical characteristics. In the days following the assassination, as Goodpasture and other analysts worked through the files, she was reviewing a set of photographs taken on September 27th, the first day of Oswald's visits. The images showed a young man approaching the Soviet embassy entrance around mid-morning. The man's face was partially visible in several frames, but the angles were not ideal for definitive facial recognition. The lighting conditions had been poor due to overcast weather that day, and the man had been wearing dark clothing that blended with the shadows cast by the embassy walls. The image quality was grainy, typical of telephoto surveillance photography from that era. Goodpasture studied the photographs carefully, comparing them to the reference images of Oswald. The facial features were suggestive: similar hairline, similar facial structure, approximately the right age and build. But photographic analysis in 1963 was an imprecise science, and she was acutely aware of the enormous consequences of making either a false positive or false negative identification. The entire intelligence community was watching. The stakes could not be higher. She continued examining the images, focusing on different aspects. She noted the clothing: dark slacks, a light-colored shirt, which matched descriptions provided by employees at the Hotel del Comercio, where Oswald had stayed. She studied the man's posture and stance, noting details of how he carried himself. And then, in several sequential photographs, taken as the man walked toward the embassy entrance, she observed his physical movement and posture with particular care. According to accounts of the analysis process that emerged in later years, identification involved comparing multiple physical characteristics visible in the surveillance photographs against known information about Oswald. This included not only facial features but also body type, approximate height and weight, posture, and the way the subject moved. In photographs showing Oswald being escorted by police after his arrest, his left shoulder was visibly lower than his right, a physical asymmetry documented in his military medical records as resulting from the 1957 elbow injury. In moving footage that had been broadcast on television showing Oswald being led through corridors, a subtle irregularity in his stride was apparent to trained observers. The analysis of the September 27th surveillance photographs, conducted by Goodpasture and reviewed by other station personnel, concluded with reasonable confidence that the images showed Lee Harvey Oswald. The assessment was based on the totality of observable characteristics: approximate age and build matching known descriptors, facial features consistent with reference photographs, clothing matching witness descriptions, and physical characteristics including posture and movement that aligned with documented information about Oswald's appearance and physical condition. Goodpasture documented her analysis in a memorandum to Win Scott. She noted the various factors supporting the identification and recommended that the photographs be classified as showing Lee Harvey Oswald visiting the Soviet embassy on September 27, 1963. Scott reviewed her assessment, consulted with other senior personnel at the station, and concurred with the conclusion. A cable was sent to CIA headquarters in Langley, correcting the earlier mistaken identification and confirming that the Mexico City station had captured photographs of Oswald during his visits to the Soviet embassy. The identification of Oswald in the surveillance photographs resolved one question but raised many others. If the CIA had photographic evidence of Oswald visiting the Soviet embassy in late September 1963, why had this information not been recognized and acted upon before the assassination? Why had the photographs initially been misidentified or overlooked in the routine analysis workflow? And most critically, did Oswald's contacts with Soviet and Cuban officials in Mexico City indicate that his assassination of President Kennedy had been directed, supported, or encouraged by foreign governments? These questions became central to the Warren Commission's investigation. The commission interviewed CIA officers, including Win Scott and Ann Goodpasture, about the Mexico City surveillance operations. Scott testified about the scope and limitations of the LILYRIC program, explaining that the volume of surveillance material generated was enormous, hundreds of photographs and hours of audio recordings daily, and that the CIA did not have the resources to analyze every piece of material in real time with equal depth. Individuals were flagged for detailed analysis if they were already known to intelligence agencies, or if their behavior during surveillance suggested they might be intelligence officers or operatives. Oswald, prior to the assassination, had not been considered a high-priority target. His file indicated that he was a former defector who had returned to the United States, but there was no specific intelligence suggesting he posed an imminent threat. Goodpasture testified about her photographic analysis work. She explained the process of comparing surveillance images against reference photographs, the challenges of working with images of varying quality, and the importance of examining multiple physical characteristics to build confidence in an identification. She acknowledged that the initial misidentification, associating Oswald's name with photographs of a different individual, had created confusion that delayed recognition of the actual photographs showing Oswald. She also acknowledged that without the post-assassination urgency and the focused allocation of analytical resources to review every photograph from the relevant time period, it was unlikely the September 27th images would have been definitively identified as showing Oswald in the weeks between his visits and the assassination. The Warren Commission also investigated whether Oswald's contacts with Soviet and Cuban officials in Mexico City had any connection to the assassination. Soviet officials interviewed in the years following the Cold War consistently stated that Oswald had been viewed by the KGB as mentally unstable and unreliable, that his requests for expedited visa processing had been denied through normal bureaucratic channels, and that no Soviet intelligence officer had recruited him or directed his actions. Declassified Soviet documents supported these accounts. Similarly, investigations of potential Cuban involvement found no credible evidence that the Cuban government had recruited Oswald, provided him with instructions or support, or had any foreknowledge of his intentions. The Warren Commission's final report, issued in September 1964, concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald had acted alone in assassinating President Kennedy, that there was no evidence of a conspiracy involving foreign governments or domestic organizations, and that Oswald's motives appeared to have been personal and ideological rather than directed by others. The report acknowledged the CIA's surveillance of Oswald in Mexico City and noted that while the intelligence had been collected, it had not been sufficient in scope or clarity to predict or prevent the assassination. The report stated that Oswald's visits to the Soviet and Cuban embassies appeared to have been attempts to secure travel documents for his planned return to the Soviet Union, and that these attempts had failed. For Ann Goodpasture, the experience of working on the Oswald case became a defining element of her career. She continued to work at the CIA's Mexico City station for more than 2 decades after 1963, eventually retiring in the 1980s after 3 decades of service. Decades after the assassination, she gave occasional interviews to journalists and historians researching the Kennedy assassination and the CIA's role in Cold War intelligence operations. In these interviews, she reflected on the analytical process and on the pressures of working in the immediate aftermath of the assassination. She described the work as both technically demanding and emotionally draining. The knowledge that Oswald had been photographed visiting the Soviet embassy, and that this information had not been recognized in time to potentially alter the course of events, weighed heavily on everyone involved. She reflected on both the process and its implications. The identification of Oswald from the surveillance photographs had been possible only because the assassination had prompted an intensive review that allocated far more analytical resources than would normally be available during routine operations. But even perfect collection, cameras that captured every visitor, audio systems that recorded every conversation, could not prevent tragedies if the collected material was not analyzed with perfect foresight about which individuals would prove significant. In September 1963, Oswald was one of hundreds of people photographed visiting Soviet and Cuban diplomatic facilities in Mexico City. Without specific intelligence indicating that he posed a threat, there was no reason to prioritize analysis of his photographs over those of many other subjects. Wynne Scott, the Mexico City station chief, faced intense scrutiny in the months and years following the assassination. Congressional committees and CIA internal review boards examined the station's operations, looking for failures or oversights that might have contributed to the tragedy. Scott defended his operations, arguing that the surveillance programs had been conducted professionally and competently, and that the failure to identify Oswald before the assassination was a result of the inherent limitations of intelligence work, limited resources, massive volumes of collected material, and the impossibility of perfect foresight, rather than negligence or incompetence. Scott remained station chief in Mexico City until 1969, when he retired from the CIA after 28 years of service. He died in 1971. After his death, his widow discovered that Scott had kept personal files and recordings related to his intelligence work, including materials related to the Oswald case and to other sensitive operations. These materials were seized by the CIA under claims that they contained classified information. Some of the materials were later declassified and released to researchers, providing additional details about the surveillance operations in Mexico City and about Scott's perspective on the events of 1963. Lee Harvey Oswald's brief visit to Mexico City in September 1963 remained a subject of intense interest for decades. Researchers, journalists, and those skeptical of the Warren Commission's conclusions scrutinized every aspect of his time in Mexico City, looking for evidence of connections to foreign intelligence services, to organized crime, or to other individuals who might have been involved in a broader conspiracy to assassinate President Kennedy. The surveillance photographs, the audio recordings, and the testimonies of those who interacted with Oswald during his visits were analyzed countless times by people seeking patterns or connections that official investigations might have missed. The question of what might have happened if the CIA had identified Oswald from the surveillance photographs in late September or early October 1963, before he returned to Dallas, was one that haunted intelligence officers and policymakers. If Oswald had been flagged as a person of interest based on his visits to the Soviet and Cuban embassies, would he have been placed under closer surveillance by the FBI? Would additional resources have been devoted to monitoring his activities in Dallas? Would his employment at the Texas School Book Depository have been noted and investigated? And if so, might the assassination have been prevented? These questions were, by their nature, unanswerable. Intelligence work in 1963, as now, involved making judgments about which threats to prioritize, which leads to follow, and which individuals to monitor closely given finite resources. In the fall of 1963, Oswald was one of thousands of Americans who had contacts with communist governments or who expressed pro-Soviet sympathies. Without specific intelligence indicating that he posed an imminent threat, and no such intelligence existed in the CIA's files or in the FBI's domestic security files, it was unlikely that he would have been subjected to intensive surveillance even if he had been definitively identified in the Mexico City photographs before the assassination. The question intelligence services never resolved was whether anyone could have predicted that this particular unstable young man, photographed walking toward a Soviet embassy seeking travel documents, would 6 weeks later change American history. Perhaps the real lesson of the Mexico City surveillance was that not everything can be predicted, even when everything is documented. The children of Lee Harvey Oswald, two daughters, June and Rachel, grew up in the shadow of their father's actions. June, who was born in February 1962, was 21 months old at the time of the assassination. Rachel, who was born in October 1963, was only 5 weeks old when her father was arrested and killed. Neither daughter had meaningful memories of their father. Marina Oswald, their mother, eventually remarried and raised her daughters away from the public eye, attempting to shield them from the enduring fascination with their father's crimes. Both daughters, in subsequent decades, gave occasional interviews in which they described the challenge of growing up as the children of one of the most infamous figures in American history. They spoke about the difficulty of constructing identities separate from their father's legacy, about the curiosity and sometimes hostility they faced from others who learned their connection to Oswald, and about their own complex feelings toward a man they never truly knew, but whose actions shaped the course of their lives. Rachel Oswald asked decades later what it was like growing up as Lee Harvey Oswald's daughter, paused before answering that you learn to introduce yourself by your married name first. Marina Oswald herself became a figure of enduring public interest. In the immediate aftermath of the assassination, she cooperated extensively with investigators, providing testimony about her husband's behavior, his political beliefs, and his activities in the months before the assassination. In subsequent decades, she gave interviews to journalists and researchers, offering her perspective on Oswald's character and motivations. She described him as a troubled man, isolated and angry, consumed by political ideologies that he did not fully understand, and driven by a need to feel important and valued. She acknowledged that she had not comprehended the depth of his instability or the possibility that he might commit violence. She spoke of her own guilt, survivor's guilt, mother's guilt, wondering if there had been something she could have said or done that might have changed the outcome. The CIA's surveillance operations in Mexico City continued long after 1963. The LILYRIC program remained active through the 1970s and into the 1980s, evolving as technology improved and as the geopolitical landscape shifted. The program generated millions of additional photographs and countless hours of audio recordings over the decades, documenting the movements and communications of Soviet and Cuban diplomats, intelligence officers, and the individuals who interacted with them. Most of this intelligence was routine and unremarkable, contributing to the gradual accumulation of knowledge about foreign intelligence operations and capabilities. Occasionally, it captured moments that had significant implications for American foreign policy and national security. The lessons drawn from the Oswald case, that intelligence material needed to be analyzed more quickly and thoroughly, that administrative errors in file management could have serious consequences, and that patterns and connections needed to be identified proactively rather than only in retrospect, became driving forces behind reforms in intelligence procedures. The CIA and other intelligence agencies invested in improved technology, expanded analytical staffs, and developed better systems for cross-referencing information from multiple sources and for flagging individuals who might warrant closer attention. The goal was to reduce the likelihood that critical intelligence would be overlooked, misidentified, or misinterpreted, though the inherent challenges of intelligence work, limited resources, imperfect information, and the fundamental difficulty of predicting human behavior meant that such failures could never be entirely eliminated. In the decades since 1963, the assassination of President Kennedy has remained one of the most analyzed and debated events in American history. The Warren Commission's conclusion that Oswald acted alone has been challenged by numerous alternative theories, some more credible than others, suggesting conspiracies involving various domestic and foreign actors. Subsequent government investigations, including the House Select Committee on Assassinations in the late 1970s, re-examined the evidence and reached conclusions that differed in some respects from the Warren Commission, though no investigation found convincing evidence of foreign government involvement. What remains undisputed is that Lee Harvey Oswald traveled to Mexico City in September 1963, that he visited the Soviet and Cuban embassies seeking assistance with travel documents, that his visits were photographed by CIA surveillance cameras, and that his identity was not confirmed from those photographs until after he had assassinated President Kennedy. The identification, when it finally came, was made through intensive analytical work conducted under urgent time pressure in the aftermath of a national tragedy. Ann Goodpasture was in her late 30s when she worked on identifying Oswald from the surveillance photographs. She was in her 50s when she retired from the CIA, and she died in 2015, having spent much of her adult life working in intelligence operations during the Cold War. In one of her final interviews, she reflected on her career and on the Oswald case with evident thoughtfulness. She was proud of her work as an analyst and of the identifications she had made over the years. But she also acknowledged that the Oswald identification, while analytically sound and professionally important, had come too late to make any difference in preventing the assassination. It was, she said, a reminder that intelligence work was often about documenting what had happened rather than preventing what might happen, and that the value of information was often clearest only after the moment when it might have been most useful had passed. Lee Harvey Oswald was 23 years old when he visited Mexico City in September 1963. He was 24 when he was arrested for assassinating President Kennedy and when he was killed by Jack Ruby 2 days later. The surveillance photographs captured him at moments when his future was uncertain, when his plans had been frustrated by bureaucratic delays and official skepticism, and when the violence he would commit was still weeks away. In the photographs, he looks like an ordinary young man, unremarkable and anonymous, walking toward buildings where he hoped to find help escaping a life he found intolerable. There is nothing in the images that suggests what he would do or what his name would come to represent. That ordinariness is perhaps the most unsettling aspect, that history-altering violence can emerge from people and circumstances that, in frozen moments captured on film, appear entirely mundane. The photographs document presence, movement, time, and place. What they cannot capture is intent, desperation, or the specific convergence of anger, opportunity, and circumstance that would lead one troubled young man to pick up a rifle and fire 3 shots that changed the course of American history. And perhaps that is the ultimate limitation of surveillance. It can document what happened, but it cannot always predict what will happen next, even when the subject is standing right there in the frame.